All right, so now let's talk about learning objectives. The conventional definition of learning objectives is that the purpose of a learning objective is to identify what teachers want students to be able to learn by the end of the lesson. In other words, they are the learning goals for the lesson. If that's the case, um, then we don't really need the assessment. But we have the assessment. I'm telling you that the assessment is an important part of a lesson plan. So we have already stated what the learning goals are by writing what the assessment is. So we really don't need the learning objectives in that case. So in a sense, I really don't want you to have that particular view of what a learning objective is because it's kind of redundant. If we have the assessment, then we don't really need the learning objectives. So there's another purpose for what a learning objective is. And that is that we want to identify what the thinking skills are for the lesson. What are the thinking skills that are associated with the lesson? The goal of there are two goals for any lesson. One, of course, is we want students to be working within the content knowledge. We want them to learn the content knowledge, to acquire the knowledge associated with the content. The other, though, is we want them to be able to think and to think within the content knowledge. So the knowledge is acquired through the process of thinking. Thinking needs to be taught. So that's what the purpose of the learning objective is, to identify the thinking associated with the learning that's taking place. For example, students will compare two characters. Well, how do we actually, how does a person make comparisons? What are the steps to making comparisons? These are things that a teacher needs to be prepared to teach. Not just that this is a literacy class and we're going to be comparing two characters, but you also need to be teaching about how comparisons can be done. So you are going to be teaching about the thinking skills. How do you determine what the thinking skills are for your assessment? Well, this requires your knowledge, of course, of the content and also thoughtful reflection on how you engage in this activity. So you need to make explicit the process by which to do the thinking skills, which may be for you, because you're college educated folks, may be very implicit to you, but you need to make it explicit so that students can engage in that thought process as well. So we know that the learning objectives need to have a focus on thinking. So that means a couple of things, or several things. One, that the verbs are important because they reflect the cognitive process that is going on. There are many different types of cognitions that we do, and you have to identify the appropriate cognitive skills required for your assessment. So some examples of cognitions or cognitive skills are to formulate an argument, to use evidence, to list techniques to express arguments, to define pathos, logos, and ethos, to use pathos, logos, and ethos to express arguments, to collect relevant data. These are examples of learning objectives, and the ones that are in bold are the cognitive processes: to formulate, to use, to list, to define, to use, to collect. Where do we get these verbs? One way is to use Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy of thinking. And Just quickly, the taxonomy of thinking goes from low order thinking skills, remembering and understanding and applying, to high order thinking skills, which is creating, evaluating, and analyzing. So originally, when Bloom came up with it, it didn't look like this. In the 1950s, when he created it, it looked a little different. But it was updated by actually his graduate students, who are now senior researchers. It was updated in 2001. So it now looks like this, essentially. And you can find a bunch of these on the internet, different graphics associated with Bloom's taxonomy. And usually there are verbs associated with it, as you can see here. Another tool that you could use, that people use, but we will not be using it in my class, but other people do use, is Norman Webb's depth of knowledge. And you can, if you look closely, you can see some of the same words associated with his taxonomy as well as Bloom's taxonomy. We will not be using it because Norman Webb's depth of knowledge is usually associated with the output of the outcome, the product itself. And for Bloom's taxonomy, it's usually referring to the cognitive process. So Webb's depth of knowledge is generally used to describe or to design what your assessment is going to look like. So you may want students to compare the two characters, but that's the product. But Bloom's taxonomy focuses on the process. How does one actually compare the two characters? Now, I know this may seem like I'm teasing apart something very fine, and it is. It is pretty much that. But for a psychologist, which I am, that difference is pretty big and it's significant. It's the difference between process versus product, the outcome versus how do you actually get there. And Bloom's taxonomy focuses on how do you actually get there. So these reflect actual cognitions. These reflect what the process is that allows students to actually have compared two characters. So that's what I want you to think about when designing learning objectives. There are some other things that you need to be aware of. Regardless if you use Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge, there's some key things you need to keep in perspective. And one is that these verbs that you see here, you can't just plug, just take and plug in to your learning objective. I'm using the appropriate verb and put it into your learning objective. It doesn't work that way. Some verbs can be low order thinking skill, like summarize, but also be high order thinking, and I'm going to show you how. So here I have students will be able to summarize the paragraph. And in this instance, it's going to be low order thinking because I want students to be able to just tell me what they remember about the paragraph. So I'm checking for comprehension or understanding, which is considered low. But I can ask students to summarize Moby Dick. I'm to some extent getting an understanding of how they understand the story, but it's such a long story, I'm also looking at what they think are the most important parts of the story. So now that elevates it to high order thinking because they have to analyze, they have to be able to distinguish what's really important from what is not important. So it becomes a high order thinking skills. a skill, a high order thinking skill. Another example, students will be able to identify the European countries on the map. In this instance, it's low order. Just can you remember where these countries are? But if I ask students to identify the main idea in a nonfiction text, now they have to identify the main idea from the less important ideas. So it becomes high order thinking. So it's important that you understand that you can't just pick and paste these verbs into your learning objectives. You have to know how they are, what they're doing in this instance. Is it requiring a low order thinking or is it a high order thinking? Here's another example. Some verbs, it may seem like you're using it, and then it's something that you would see in one of the graphics that you get online, but it may not actually have the meaning that you intend. For example, students will be able to recognize the contributions of African Americans during Black History Month. That may be your learning objective, or you may think that is a good learning objective because it's using the word recognize, and you find recognize in the list of verbs from Bloom's taxonomy. But if you really think about it, that's not what this verb is really doing. It's not reflecting a cognitive process. In this instance, what we're really saying is that we want students to be able to, we want to honor the contributions of African Americans during Black History Month. We want students to appreciate the contributions of African Americans during Black History Month. That is not a cognitive process. It's sort of an outcome. So how do we make this more of a cognitive process? Well, one thing is we can say that we want students to list prominent African Americans. So this is sort of that remembering process. The other thing that we may want them to do is to explain the contributions of prominent African Americans. Now that reflects more understanding. So these are better written than that one. There are verbs to avoid when writing learning objectives. And here they are. The ones on the left of your screen are the ones that are well written, the ones to the left of the screen are poorly written, and these on the right are well written. They're sort of the translation. I'm going through this quickly because I'm taking way too much time. But students will be able to know how to conduct science. Know is not very specific. It's a broad category. Students will be able to demonstrate their ability. What do we mean, demonstrate the ability? We're looking for the cognitive process. The same with these others. Analyze. Analyze in Bloom's taxonomy is actually a category. But in this particular instance, it's not specific enough. We want to be specific. How do we want students to analyze? We may want students to analyze by listing the explicit and implicit traits of the main character. Similarly, evaluate is a Bloom's taxonomy category. But what do we mean specifically? Well, specific we may mean students will be able to formulate an argument against the author's position. So it's important that you avoid using these verbs and really try to think about what is it that you're specifically looking for. Here are the properties of a well-written objective. You want to make sure that a learning objective is student-centered, so you always are focused on students. SWBAT stands for students will be able to. You should never focus on what you're doing. You shouldn't be focusing on that I will lecture. Instead, you should focus on students will be able to identify the main idea in a book. Objectives should not contain an activity or a specific product. So a bad example is students will be able to solve quadratic equations listed in the chapter. So that is specific to an activity. You just want to focus on the thinking skill. so students will be able to solve quadratic equations. Because it doesn't matter if it's in the chapter, or if it's on a worksheet, or if it's something that you created or something that they see on a video. What's really essential is that they can solve quadratic equations. Doesn't matter where they come from. So don't focus on the activity, focus on the thinking. Learning objectives. For each lesson plan, you should have only 2 to 3 learning objectives. Any more than that, it seems like it's too much to actually try to teach. You want to keep it short, just a few things, because whatever you put in your learning objective, that says that you're going to teach it. And depending on your class, it may be easy to teach all 3, or maybe you can only focus on one. So as a rule, try not to go over 2 to 3 because it may be impossible to do an effective job on teaching more than 3 objectives. So in review, we've talked about learning objectives and that they need to focus on thinking skills. You need to choose your verbs very carefully, and you want to make sure that you do not select more than 3 objectives per lesson. Now that we have our assessment and our learning objectives covered, let's talk about instruction in the next screencast.